Arianna Rigamonti is here to tell us about some wonderful and beautiful instruments that are just plain marvelous. Arianna is a PhD candidate at the Royal College of Music in London, and she has held 2 internships at St. Cecilia's in Edinburgh, and also at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. She holds a master's degree from the University of Pavia, and also she's a violin diploma. You have a violin diploma from the Donizetti Conservatory of Bergamo. Arianna, please, thank you.
So good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. And first of all, I would like to thank AMIS for awarding me their small research grant for students, and so I'm glad to be here. So this morning, I'm going to present a part of my research, of my doctoral research. Thank you. My presentation is titled Italian Non-Sounding Musical Instrument in the Age of the Marvelous, Functional Objects Without Function. So I would like to start with this quote by the Italian bishop and story writer Matteo Bandello from 1554. If there ever was an age when one sees various and wondrous things, I believe that ours is one. For it is an age in which more than any other, things happen that are worthy of astonishment, compassion, and reproach. So these words were introduced the importance of the marvelous and wondrous things at his time. So in fact, the events, aesthetics, and cultural circumstances in 16th and 17th century Western Europe led modern scholars, especially Joy Kenseth, to define this period as the age of the marvelous. Here I've listed some examples to show how the marvelous was embedded in the cultural context of 16th and 17th century Italy, specifically because this is the focus of my own research. So the revival of ancient Greek and Roman mythology, miraculous events that were part of the Catholic religious beliefs, surprising and unusual objects exhibited as the skull cabinets of curiosities, distorted image of the world admired thanks to the new optical and reflective devices, imagination boosted by reports from travels towards unknown land, and the magnificent court festivals with triumphal processions, theatrical and musical performances, games, fabulous machines. So within these interests for the marvelous, one could find non-sounding musical instruments. And especially as a part of a collection of curiosity or as a prop in theatrical performances during the court celebration. But what do I mean with non-sounding musical instruments? So to answer to this question, I use the words by erudite Ercole Bottrigari, who described in 1594 the collection owned by Alfonso II of Este, Duke of Ferrara. He distinguished used musical instruments from unused ones, and he wrote, quote, "Unused instruments should be understood in 2 ways. One is that these instruments, because of their age, are not now employed, but are kept because of their shapes, different from the ones in which they are usually made today. The other way to understand unused is that the instruments are almost unique because of their rarity." So non-sounding instruments in Alfonso II of Este collection were ancient instruments to be preserved, and others that were considered rare and unique. So aren't these the same reason why we keep instruments silent in museums today? So in this presentation, I consider as non-sounding musical instruments both unused instruments as musical instruments that could potentially be played but were kept silent to be preserved because rare and unique, and non-playable instruments as silent objects built in the shape of musical instruments. So in both cases, non-sounding musical instruments set aside their acoustic function in favor of their extraordinary manufacture, the preciousness of their materials or their appearance. So they represented symbolic objects of marvels rather than tools to make music. So looking at other objects of marvel that were built in the shape of functional items, I will discuss in this paper the reasons and symbolism behind the fact that some musical instruments were kept silent to be preserved through centuries, or built with no acoustic function at all. So to explore this, I will focus on two specific case studies that cover the two settings where a non-sounding musical instrument could be found. So first, the court festival that happened in Florence in 1589, in occasion of the marriage of Ferdinand I of Medici and Christine of Lorraine. In particular, I will focus on some musical instruments that were used on stage during the performance of musical intermedi for La Pellegrina by Girolamo Jacopi. And second, I will move to Modena at the court of Francesco II of Este in 1680s to look at the musical instrument in his collection of marvels. So let's start with the first case study. So intermedi were those music and dramatic entertainments inserted between the acts of a play. And in this case, I'll focus on La Pellegrina. In the account of the event written by Girolamo Jacopi, there is a description of the harp held by the singer Jacopo Peri, that was called the Zazzerino, who was acting the part of Arion in the 15th intermedium. He states that, quote, Giovanni Bardi, who was the chief organizer of the performance, says to build a paper harp for the Zazzerino that has to throw himself on the dolphin. So the harp was therefore made of paper, so it was a fake musical instrument that did not sound and was a mere theatrical prop. The singer was most likely accompanied by a common harp played by a musician in the ensemble located on the side of the stage. So through the sketch of Arion costumes drawn by Bernardo Buontalenti, who was a set and costume designer of the whole performance, we can have an idea of the paper harp, how the paper harp looked like. So the harp is decorated with an elegant feminine bust, and we expect indeed it was made of paper. So another drawing made by the same Bernardo Buontalenti shows Apollo's costume in the same performance, and Apollo in this case is holding a sort of lyre that might be made of paper as well. In this case, the lyre appears with no sounding box at all, and was therefore not thought to be played, even though it maybe might have not been made of paper. So both Arion's harp and Apollo's lyres were non-sounding theatrical props and serve more as attributes to the mythological characters than as musical instruments. So another passage of Jacopi's account of the performance explains the practice of disguising musical instruments. While describing the fourth intermedio entitled The Region of Demons, he reports, the wrapping of taffeta around the trombones to make them look like serpents is the duty of the keeper of costumes. The historical surviving musical instrument in the shape of monstrous creatures, such as these in the slide, fit perfectly the aesthetic of a hellish scene and might have been built for these kind of theatrical performances. And in particular, these two instruments have been studied in detail by scholar Herbert Hyde, who provided evidence that they were not meant as professional musical instruments, but because of their manufacture. So they were not completely silent, but they were not able to play a melody in tune. So although these kind of instruments were not completely silent, as I said, their appearance was definitely more important than their acoustic properties. So they were not more non-sounding objects to be shown in a collection rather than musical instruments. A professional musician would have never chosen one of those instruments, but a music enthusiastic nobleman would have desired them as part of their collection. So let's move now to the second case study, which looks indeed at a collection of curiosities. In particular, this is the one of Francesco II of Este, who was Duke of Modena from 1662 until his death in 1694. So if we look at surviving musical instruments that are kept today at the Galleria Estense, we find the famous Este harp, a viola by the Cremonese Girolamo Amati, a violin and a cello made by Domenico Galli, and 4 instruments made of marble, a harpsichord, a guitar, a recorder, and a violin. So among these, the instruments that elicit doubt regarding their sound properties are galleys, violins, and cello for being highly carved and decorated, as well as the 4 instruments made of marble. So let's start with a closer look at Domenico Sgalli's instruments. So their soundboards are completely full of inlaid ornaments, and their back presents extraordinary carvings of allegoric images, among which Hercules executing Hydra on the cello, on the back of the cello, as shown here in the picture. And at the bottom of the violin fingerboard, there is a miniature with a dedication to the Duke Francesco II of Este. So the carvings reveals some holes on the back and the sides of both of instruments, which led some scholars thinking that both instruments were mute. However, when Domenico Galli presented the cello to Francesco II of Este in court in Modena, he accompanied the instrument with a series of compositions for cello solo entitled Trattenimento Musicale, Musical Entertainments, and dedicated to the Duke. The author of these compositions were the same Domenico Galli, and they represent the first example of an accompanied suites for cello solo. This fact might reconsider the acoustic properties of the cello that probably had his own voice then. The cello has been indeed recently played in 1984 by the Dutch cellist Anner Bylsma, who played the Trattenimento Musicale at the Teatro Comunale in Modena. But nevertheless, these suites present fast passages, sudden range shifts, trills, and other virtuoso techniques that required a skilled musician, but also a good and comfortable instrument to play with. But if we look at some details of the cello, it is evident that it was not really a comfortable instrument to play with. For example, the protruding crown at the top of the back of the cello is located exactly where the cello touches the chest of the musician while playing. So there was the easy risk of breakage or maybe a bit of a pain. So, and also the tortoiseshell and intarsia on the fingerboard makes fast left-hand passages more complex. Same considerations can be shown on the violin, starting from the acoustical impairments to the holes in both the sides of the instrument and the back. Then the highly carved tailpiece makes impossible, or at least very uncomfortable and painful for the violinist to hold the instrument. And the fingerboard is covered with glass, so might result slippery for the violinist's left hand, even if playing most of the time in the first position. And eventually, the carvings at the back of the neck make left-hand shifts harder. So for these reasons, even though Galli's instrument could be played, there were surely more marvelous objects for showiness rather than professional musical instruments. They have been spending most of their existence in silence rather than being played. Up to today, they are kept silent in the museum display. Let's now have a look to the marble instruments held in the Galleria Estense. So all of them are made in 1680s. The harpsichord made in Carrara by Michele Antonio Grandi. Then we have a recorder and a guitar attributed to the same maker, and the violin that has an inside label that reads the name of Giovanni Battista Cassarini. So did his instrument sound? In his study on the marble harpsichord, Gabriele Rossi Rognoni proved that this instrument was first conceived just as a showpiece, and the present wooden action inside the instrument was a later addition, and probably from the early 20th century, since it was not compatible with some original parts of the instrument. The recorder has holes of not all of the same. All the holes have the same dimensions, so it means that it couldn't play in tune. And the tuning pegs of the violins are roughly made, so making them efficiently for tuning the strings. And the guitar has no sound hole at all in the sound box, so we can imagine that it was completely silent. So these considerations led to assess these marble instruments as a showpiece again, and even if some of them could produce sound, their musical functions resulted very limited. So later in the centuries, the sound of marble instruments seemed to have raised a strong interest due to various sources that suggest that marble instruments actually sounded. For example, Giovanni Targioni Donizetti in 1779 wrote that he bought a marble guitar by Michele Antonio Grandi that sounded, quote, louder and much pleasant than the usual modern guitars. Girolamo Tiraboschi stated in 1786 that Duke Francesco II wanted a musician to play Grandi's marble guitar in the chamber. And Giuseppe Campori, in 1873, said that the sound of marble instrument is, quote, not equal to that of similar wooden instruments, but not at all unpleasant. So it seems that the interest of playing such instruments has developed much afterwards their construction, and there is a paradox between these documentary sources and the marble objects that appear completely silent, as we saw before. So since there are no evidences that in the 17th century those instruments could sound, it is most likely that later modifications to the original instruments have been made to make them efficient in order to encounter 18th and 19th century necessity for acoustic function on an object, on a shape of a musical instrument. Or otherwise, there could have been a parallel tradition of marble instruments that could actually play. Okay, so the Galleria of Francesco II included many other objects that somehow have lost their primary function to become showpieces like the presented musical instruments. The earliest inventory of the collection after the entry of musical instruments in 1680s is the one made by Padre Pietro Zerbini from 1751. And this inventory follows the order of objects through their position in the room and in the 8 wardrobes that were commissioned specifically at the Galleria. Thanks to the details of the inventory, Sonia Cavicchioli curated this virtual reconstruction of the room in occasion of the temporary exhibition in Modena between 2017 and 2018. Do you see any musical instrument in the video? Well, no, they were not in this room. So they were in the atrium on the room that was unfortunately not part of this virtual reconstruction. The atrium of the room was called the Piccola Galleria, small Galleria. So here there were 4 wardrobes, and in the first one there were a guitar made of marble within its case and lock, a violin made of marble, 2 recorders, one bigger than the other, made of red and white veined marble. The smaller one all red. So some of these instruments might have been the same as the one that I showed before and that are survived today in the Galleria Estense. So let's see now what other objects were collected in the Galleria and objects that had some function but were left there unused. So I will look at the already mentioned inventory from 1751, then the previous inventory drafted by Don Giovanni Donzi in 1669, and all the objects that I show in the next slides are surviving objects that are kept now in the Galleria Estense. So we could find precious cutleries that probably nobody ever used to eat. Extraordinary goblets, bottles, and carafes that might have never got wet. Trays and salt shaker that may have never seen any food or salt as well. And then this ivory buckle that has probably never been worn. So all of these objects were just showpieces, so were left unused in the gallery, but were there to be admired, were there exposed and to be admired. Objects exhibited in the cabinets were also the subjects of still nature paintings that sometimes appeared like a disordered catalogue of preciousness and possessions. So musical instruments found their place together with other objects in such paintings, and in the renewed artworks by Evaristo Baschenis and Bartolomeo Bettera, musical instruments were depicted with dust on them. So together with other items such skulls, hourglasses, clocks, worn-out candles, and withered flowers, the dust was a symbol, an allegorical element of tempus fugit, so time passing, as well as a reminder of the ephemeral condition of life and the inescapability of death, the memento mori. So the dust has continued the tradition of broken strings and broken instruments in 17th century allegorical depictions, such as these examples by Fra Giovanni da Verona, Filippino Lippi, and Raphael. So non-sounding musical instruments, as well as other unused objects exhibited in cabinets, were gathered in a room and have been collecting dust and represented in natural steel painting. So they can be considered as well symbols of time passing and caducity of life. In fact, a collection of goods reflected the vanitas of its owner in the sense of both vanity for possessions and powers and fragility of humans in their desires compared to the inescapable death. So, however, at the same time, Francesco de Saconoveste, as well as many other contemporary collectors, managed to be immortal through their collections of marvels. Still today, in fact, we can admire the same unused objects in the museum gallery that are still collecting dust and remember the Duke's powers and vanitas. So either as theatrical props in the fictional world of the theater, or as exhibited unused objects, non-sounding musical instruments represent the value of the appearance of musical instruments at the time, pushing beyond their musical functions, as well as the importance of this aesthetic of marvelous in the 16th and 17th century Italy. Thank you for your attention.
I remember several years ago in Florence, the exhibition they had with some of these instruments in it, and we just, it was just amazing.
Unfortunately, I didn't see that exhibition, but I have the catalog and
yes.
I love it.
Do you think that beyond the point of them being beautiful objects and being status symbols, that there was any more symbolic function behind the instruments?
Yeah, as I said, maybe this idea of the vanitas, the caducity of life, so leaving these instruments just there with no function, but with the time passing, and as in the still nature painting, and then at the same time, so this idea of time passing, I remember that, the memento mori, but then at the same time, these objects became immortal and made their owner immortal because we can still see them centuries after. So I think this symbolism is really fascinating.
And what a shame we don't know the names of the makers.
In many cases, yeah.
Yes. Any questions, comments? No? Thank you for this beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
And I hope to hear more about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.